Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a recent decision by a military grievance tribunal that found that the Canadian Armed Forces vaccine mandate was unconstitutional. Now, Josh, before we get too deep into the decision, I want to just briefly touch on why the Constitution applies in this case, because a lot of people might be familiar with vaccine mandates that their employers imposed. And of course, your employer's conduct is not covered by the charter or by the Constitution. Why was this mandate on the armed forces covered by the Constitution?
So the chief of defense staff, who is the person that put this directive in place, is they're essentially creating a regulation when they put in place these directives, and that's the government imposing the vaccine mandate in this particular case, and so the charter applies to government action, including these directives.
Thanks for that explanation, Josh. Now, how did this decision compare to some of the other decisions that we have seen on the constitutionality of vaccine mandates? Now, as far as I know, this is the first time any type of court or tribunal has found a government mandate violated the Constitution, as opposed to violating employment rights or rights under the Human Rights Code.
Yeah, this is also the only case that I'm aware of where the mandate's been found unconstitutional. But there were a bunch of cases that sort of flew over most people's heads that they probably haven't heard about, where courts did find that the rights that we talked about, so the right to make your own medical decisions under liberty and the right to bodily integrity under security of the person, were engaged. And in those cases, the courts just found that these were like demonstrably justified limits. So Section 1 came into play, and the government was able to, meet its burden of showing that these limits were justified. But those cases were pretty different from this case, because they involve things like, for example, one person wanted to go to yoga classes in one case. In another case, students wanted to enroll in college, and they were told you have to wait until this vaccine mandate ends to enroll in college. Whereas this case was about someone's livelihood. They lose their job, they lose their income, they lose their housing in some cases in the military. So it was a much more serious infringement of their rights. And there was also a famous case, a very sad case, Christine. I think we've talked about this before, of a woman named Sheila Annette Lewis in Edmonton, or pardon me, in Alberta, and she needed an organ transplant, and for whatever reason, she decided she would not get vaccinated for COVID-19. And the courts looked at this case, and they said that her rights were not even engaged, which is just plain wrong. And it went to the Court of Appeal, which confirmed that decision. And the Supreme Court sadly decided not to hear her case. And even though Ms. Lewis ended up having COVID, and she had antibodies from COVID, and could have been well protected for that organ transplant, she still was not able to get it, and she actually passed away. So
It's a really tragic
that's
case.
that's a really sad one there.
I mean, I do understand at the outset of the pandemic, maybe the calculus was different when there was were a lot more unknowns, but to continue to uphold this requirement as the pandemic kind of waned and as the virus became more, kind of just a part of daily life, I just don't see how there could be any finding, not just that it wasn't a justified limit on her rights, but that her rights weren't limited at all. It's so strange to me. So I want to talk briefly in the time that we have left, about a minute. Why in this case, in the tribunal case, was it so significant that this committee found there was a constitutional violation as opposed to a violation of a statutory right like an employment standard right or human rights laws? Why does it matter here that this was a decision about our Constitution and our charter rights?
It matters because of the precedent. Now, it's not binding on other courts. It's not binding on other judges, but it's a decision that spells out the reasons why some vaccine mandates were unconstitutional, and it really ought to give judges pause when they're deciding other cases. And I think the woman who wrote this decision, she got this right. And
Mhm.
judges are not going to be able to ignore that. They're going to have to at least consider these arguments going
Yeah, and
forward.
I think they'll have to
Um,
engage with it. That we've got to go to commercial break now, Josh. But when we come back, I want to talk about what made this case different, why the tribunal came to this different conclusion. We'll be right back.